Those were the days.
Hey everyone, Justin Lee Howard here with another edition of Those Were Days Extended, and today we are actually going to have a fun one today. I This is a plot line that I think a lot of people really liked, and started off premise sort of starts off a little silly, but I think once you get into it, you realize how there was some really good acting involved, and just some really sort of quick thinking and interesting storytelling here. And of course, I am talking about the ubiquitous fan favorite Stan storyline. And to start it out, where am I here? I'm gonna take you guys back to September 22nd, 2005, excuse me. This is when Kate interrupted Lucas and Sammy's wedding, dressed as Stan, to expose basically that Sami was Stan after all. And this is her showing up as Stan and then taking off the mask, revealing that Stan was actually Sami in disguise all these years. And just to give you a little background here, if you did not, if you don't remember this storyline, you definitely missed out. I wish there was a way to kind of uh, either have it recorded or bring it back to you. But yeah, but if you don't remember this one, actually, ooh, I am so sorry. It looks like I don't know if you guys are seeing me. One second. It's recording, I see, but let me see. So there we go. Okay, sorry, had the wrong background up there. But yeah, if you guys remember the storyline, this came at the heels of what was going on. This was sort of after the Mela Swan storyline, or sort of towards sort of the tail end of the Mela Swan storyline when everyone was still away. But I think before they did the first initial rescue, and then eventually everyone came back with the second rescue, it was sort of in that time period. It's 2005. The character of Sami at this point had gotten really close with Lucas, and they had developed a rapport, and they were sort of doing this, second time around kind of thing and really coming together. Kate was not a fan of it at all. She basically set up Sami with Brandon. I think if I remember correctly, I think she drugged them and put them in bed together and arranged for Lucas to find them. So Lucas would be pissed. He broke off their engagement. And of course, at the time, Brandon wasn't with Sami. So I think he had left town at this point. And so Lucas hates her, and he, breaks off the engagement with her. Brandon has left town. He has no interest in Sami at this point. I think Will is living with Lucas at this point. Marlena and Roman are dead, storyline wise. And so Sami was all alone. And it was sort of interesting because it was very reminiscent of the beginning parts of the Devil storyline from Marlena, when the Devil was sort of able to get to her back in the 90s because she was in such a vulnerable state. If you remember that storyline, it had just been revealed that Belle was in fact John's daughter and not Roman's. She was sort of like a little bit of a social pariah because the affair was exposed and people were turning on her. Patients were canceling with her. And so she was getting all this sort of like scrutiny and sort of felt alone. And that's what allowed sort of the Devil to come in. So parallel to this storyline, where her daughter Sami is sort of feeling the same thing. She's at this point a little bit of the town pariah. No one believes her. Again, like I said, Brandon left town and Lucas has abandoned her, and Marlene and Roman are dead. And like I said, Will is with Lucas, and so she feels all alone. She gets this interesting sort of a package from Tony DeMira, who we know. Oh, actually, now before we go there, before I go there with plot, I just want to say what set this up and set this whole like plot thing in motion, the Stan storyline, and just so people, if you don't remember the storyline or haven't seen it, this is actually when, at this point in time, Alison Sweeney is the quintessential star of the show. She is in almost every scene. She's driving storyline. Sami, again, like I said, was the star of the show at this time. And the show had centered around Sami for about a few years at this point, really heavily. And so her and her husband, Alison Sweeney, her and her husband become pregnant So she needs to take maternity leave. So instead of having, Sami go on a trip or have her in the back burner for plans, they had so many, it was sort of like, oh, we don't want to like sideline Alison, even though she's on maternity leave. How do we kind of get around this? How do we keep her front and center? Everyone loves Sami. So how do we keep that going? So they came up with this brilliant idea that they weren't going to hire a recast to play Sami for the 3 months or 12 weeks or 4 months or whatever it was, the maternity leave, but they decided to hire a man to do it. And here we have Dan Wells, and if you can see Alison Sweeney here on the left, Dan Wells on the right, and as you can see, there is a resemblance here, and basically the idea was that Dan Wells was going to play Sami disguised as a man, in that the plotline was that Sami, in sort of her vulnerable state, was contacted by Tony DeMira, who we now know was actually Andre back then, by Andre DeMira, contacted with a sort of dossier of like revenge against certain people in town and a disguise. And so the idea was that Sami would dress up as this character named Stan and pull off all these sort of schemes for Andre DeMira for him to sort of exact revenge on all the people who had ruined him or crossed him, kind of a thing. And Sami sort of at a low point then decided that she was game. Like I said, she was sort of at this point the town pariah, and I think she also lost her job through this, and so it was also a way for her to kind of make some money and to kind of come out on top and to exact her own little bit of revenge here, because people, like I said, had turned on her, not in the exact fashion the same way they did on Tony and Andre and the DeMiras, but she definitely was feeling lonely and alone at this point. So yeah, they bring in this amazing actor, Dan Wells. If you guys watch the storyline, I can't talk about him enough. He is just really incredible and just did this amazing job where he came in. If you guys remember, it started off, as you can see here, you see sort of like the transformation of, and I remember these scenes like Alison Sweeney, and the way that they did this so that people understand. They shot a series of scenes before Alison went away where she would start off the scene and sort of start off the dialogue in the scene as Sami, and then sort of, as you can see here, she's putting on the mustache and she's putting on the makeup and she's looking in the mirror, and that leads to the transformation of Stan at this point. And what they did was they filmed Sweeney. They filmed those scenes before she went on her maternity leave, and then they just spread them out through the duration of the storyline. So it wasn't Alison Sweeney coming in every single week to do like a transformation scene or whatever. And it was just brilliant, because at that point, it wasn't that Sami turned into Stan and she lived as Stan for the next 3 to 4 months. They had these little snippets where you would see Ali as herself, and then she would start the transformation process, or she'd get a call, or she'd have a small interaction with someone. So all of those interactions were filmed before Alison Sweeney went on. It just took a lot of planning. And again, at the time, we all sort of know how far in advance they shoots, and it can be funny sometimes, and we make fun of it and we get frustrated with it sometimes. But in this case, they probably weren't as far along as they are now, like 8 months of shooting. But at the time, they were certainly far enough to film all those scenes and have all that mapped out to be able to film Ali's stuff, send her on maternity leave, and then sprinkle those scenes in where they needed to, but also having Dan on set doing the day-to-day stuff as Stan/Sami. And if you remember the story, like I said, we cannot say, whenever we talk about it on Dishin days, we cannot say enough about Dan. And maybe we should interview him sometime in the future, because I think it'd be interesting to get his perspective on this. But if you're watching, like I said, it was such an inspired way to do it. It wasn't bringing in another woman to replace Alison Sweeney, who, like I said, was driving so much storyline at the time, and Sami was the quintessential star of the show. But I think what was so great about Dan is he really put in the work. He meticulously studied Alison Sweeney's mannerisms. he got her voice down so that when the way they would do it in using sort of the pictures up here, when she would transform into him and get in the makeup, they would sort of have him talk as Alison Sweeney just to like sell the transformation and then to sell like the voice changer of it, because in addition to the disguise and the directions that Tony sent her, there was a voice changer, so that sort of explained how she was able to sound different. But Dan just, and he's done a lot of interviews since then, especially at that time in the early 2000s, where he talked about it, and he talked about just studying and watching so much tape of Ali Sweeney and her mannerisms and the way she carries herself and the way she interacts with certain people. And it was so great when you watch it. He infused all of that into it. And there's even some one of the great things he did, not only the voice and like I said, the manners, but he infused, there's like a slight hint of femininity there in the performance that you realize like, oh, this is Sami. This is, you know, when he would have certain interactions with certain people, whether it was Lucas or Kate or just, you know, we'll get into sort of the revenge schemes that Stan had done during that time. But like I said, this was this really interesting way to kind of handle a star of the show taking a leave. In this case, it was a maternity leave, but just a really inspired way. And I think Days doesn't get enough credit for coming up with these sort of innovative ways of doing things. And I know we always talk about the Devil storyline and how that was so interesting to people and polarizing to some. And was it a jump the shark moment, or was it a way to reignite and invigorate the show? And I compare this to this not in terms of scope, but just in terms of a thinking outside the box. Just the producers and the writers being able to come up with this, and sort of Ali being game and finding just the perfect talent in Dan Wells here with this performance. I gotta tell you, if you haven't seen it, try and find some clips on it. If people have clips, try and share them, just because it was just an inspired, real performance. It's funny because I think there was no sort of awards talk or anything like that back then. I don't think people were thinking about it in that context, but I feel like now, if this had happened now, like he would be I think, you know, we'd be pushing for him to get an Emmy, just because, again, like I said, it was such a great performance. And you could tell that Dan really put in the work, and it really showed on screen. And this was this sort of like mini umbrella storyline that just really carried through for the summer. Like I said, it started out sort of late spring and then carried through the summer, and then sort of turned around. And like I said, when I mentioned Kate exposing Sami, that actually happened late September. So, you know, Stan had been causing havoc all summer and sort of early or late spring at this point. So yeah, just hats off. Like I said, I can't say enough good things about Dan Wells and everything he did. But plot wise, if you don't remember, like I said, Sami was sort of enacting these revenge plots against people. And I have to say, story-wise, this is something that probably should have ruined the character of Sami because of the things that she did. But I think people got caught up in the fantasy and in the creativity of this storyline, that I think like a lot of it was hand waved away, or a lot of it was, you know, oh, that's Sami, or this was, you know, another one of Sami's schemes. But if you don't remember, a few of the things that she did, which were just really awful, and shows you the place that Sami was in, that she would do this to not only family members, but people she really sort of presumed to care about. And I think in a lot of ways she crossed the line here, but like I said, it was so interesting to watch and so kind of creative that I think people, you know, like I said, we hand waved it away or we made excuses, and, you know, that's Sami, but this was probably Sami at her worst during this sort of Stan Saga. But yeah, one of the things she did, she got John hooked on drugs. If you guys remember that storyline, he had, I believe this was after the second attempt at Mela Swan, where he didn't rescue like a lot of the residents, and then they ended up being stuck on that shit. So this was after that, and I believe John hurt his back, so he was on painkillers. And then Sami, dressed up as Stan, was basically like pushing drugs on him because he was getting addicted to it. And so, yeah, this is when they had that John, addiction storyline. And it was Sami as Stan who was like feeding him drugs and getting him hooked on and like, feeding him being an addict, which was kind of bizarre and out there, but just really good. And it delved into, of course, the history of Sami and John. And at that, like I said, that this was probably her worst in sort of some of the schemes she did, just because they were so outwardly. Usually, it's someone who directly affects Sami, and she can kind of go after them, and either you can kind of root for it, or you can kind of roll your eyes a little bit, but still be on board with it. But yeah, I think deeds aside, we appreciated it so much because of the performance of Dan Wells, and the writing at the time was just so kind of out there and like interesting. It was like, oh, what is Stan going to do next? And one of those things he did was in an interesting twist of fate, he I keep saying he, it's as in Stan, because he went and basically taunted Bo and Billy with the idea that Georgia, their daughter, may still be alive. And this was, of course, before they brought on Chelsea as the daughter. And funny twist of fate, in the middle of Stan taunting them, he basically sent them on this wild goose chase to find Georgia. And ironically, who did they find? I wish I could find that. I think it may have been scrubbed from the internet, but ironically, Rachel Melvin actually played a fake Georgia back then. And then that Bo and Billy actually find overseas, and they find her and think she's their daughter. And then Tony comes in, who's really Andre, comes in and sort of kind of bursts their bubble and sort of makes fun of them and kind of throws it in their face as a way to get back at them. And the funny thing was, like I said, it was Rachel Melvin who would go on to later play a recast Chelsea after the first actress, after the original actress sort of wasn't on the show anymore. So she came back. So it was a fun little twist of fate that she actually played, a fake Georgia originally, and then came back as a recast Chelsea Brady. And then she is the one we know as the Chelsea Brady sort of moving forward. But yeah, it was that. It was this weird plot line. If you guys remember when Philip was a soldier, and this ironically is, and here we have this picture always makes me laugh because it's on the left here. It's Kyle Lauder, and he was at the time playing Philip Kirakis. And then of course we have Dan Wells on this side, who was Stan, aka Sami, dressed up. And this is actually the plot line that we got that led to Philip having his prosthetic leg, where he gets captured. He's a soldier in Iraq, and Stan and Brady and I want to say John and maybe Sean, I think. Someone correct me below, who was involved in that like rescue mission. And one of the fallouts of that rescue mission was Philip having to get his leg amputated. So if you never knew where that came from, it actually comes from this storyline, the sort of mini umbrella storyline of the Stan Saga. And he also did a few other things to other people. It just was this sort of madcap, sort of storyline of pop fiction that sounds crazy, but like I said, between Ali and Dan Wells and everyone involved, they played it so real. Like I said, kudos to Dan. He was sort of the star of this storyline and really sold it. And I think a lot of that was due, like I said, to a lot of his hard work in studying Alison Sweeney to be able to portray and perform it. And true to life, that was not the last time we actually saw Stan. He actually came back about a decade later. And I want to say this was, God, if I remember correctly, we're in 2005. This was about 2002, 22, 23. This was when Sami had been gone from the show and Alison Sweeney came back to reprise Sami for a storyline. This was that storyline where Lucas was sort of pretending to have cancer, or Chloe thought he was having cancer, and he was keeping up the charade so that she wouldn't find out the truth about something, I forget. And she decided to bring him in to get a second opinion on thinking he has a cancerous tumor. And him and Sami, Lucas and Sami, were sort of panicking of what they were going to do. We didn't want Chloe to find out. And so Sami was like, I have an idea. And she goes out And we got the surprise of a lifetime when the doctor walks in, aka Dr. Dunn, and we see that it is actually Stan. And yeah, just being like this really sort of fun, interesting callback, almost 10 years later from the fact. And you can see here, this is the point where Lucas is looking at him like, oh my God, or looking at her, I'll say, as because he knows that Sami underneath and thinking, oh my God, you came in as Stan here and you're pretending to be this Dr. Dunn at this moment. And it was just a hilarious scene. Hats off to Brian Dotillo in this scene. He always the comedian, sort of keeping a straight face, but letting us know that Lucas remembers and does in fact know what's going on here. But loved how this was played off. This fun little cameo that they decide to sort of bring Dan Wells back here for this. And then ironically, later on, we think it's sort of this quick little one note thing, but they sort of ingratiate it into the plot line by having Chloe here sort of wonder like, oh, I've seen this person before. I know who this is? And then we get this sort of little flashback, and this is from Chloe's perspective after they have this consultation, and she actually runs into Sami, and then we get this flashback, and this is what presents on screen, and we say Dan Wells here on the left, 2005. She's remembering him because she had a scene with him on the pier that was like a very quick little, nothing really major to the plot, but it was also just though we got those scenes back then of people running into Stan and having interactions with him, and sort of Sami having to pull off this Stan charade up against people she knew. So that's what this flashback is on the left. And then we have, of course, almost 10 years later, Dan Wells here coming back to surprise a closer look here as Dr. Dunn. And that is how they sort of brought the Stan character back eight, 9 years later for a little cameo to kind of throw him in there. But I would personally love to have Dan Wells back on the show. And if you guys remember at the time, there was this big push that because Dan Wells was so great in the show, there was this push to people wanted to bring him back as Eric Brady, because at the time Jensen had been gone from the show for a while and we knew he wasn't coming back. And at the time, this was before they cast Greg Vaughn as Eric. And I don't think Eric was on the horizon. I don't think they were thinking of bringing him back, but sort of seeing Dan's performance and thinking, oh my God, he looks so much like Alison Sweeney. Why not? And he's so good and we don't want to lose him. Like, let's bring him back and have him be Eric Brady. Unfortunately, that did not happen, of course. But yeah, I'm still holding out hope and fingers crossed that we still get Dan Wells back on the show. Like, whether it's as Eric Brady or if it's another character, I just think he's so talented. And if you've seen Dan Wells in other stuff, he still does act. He also primarily is a big fitness instructor, so you may have seen him on shows promoting fitness, and I think he's been a coach on one of those like fitness shows where people get into shape, and you've probably seen him on that. He still does act, fingers crossed, so you can kind of see him around. He's been in a few shows the last few years, but fingers crossed. I don't know. I think he was just such a find, and the storyline was just so fun and interesting and a way for the powers that be to think outside the box. And I'm glad that they didn't go the traditional route and find another actress to just replace Alison Sweeney for those 3 to 4 months. I love the way that they did this and did it in a fun, interesting way. So fingers crossed we get a little bit more wacky hijinks like that. I think these are the things that set Days of Our Lives apart from other soap operas. And I think like the Devil storyline or the Mela Swan storyline or this one, this is when they pull it off, they pull it off really well and it makes a lasting impression. So hopefully we'll see the Stan character come back, and for maybe a little bit more than a cameo, I think would be nice. So yeah, thanks so much. And I will see you guys on the next one. Thanks everyone. Bye.
Those were the days.